You think you're so smart? Then fly it. Victoria Ashford's finger stabbed toward the $28 million helicopter, the same machine that had humiliated her company 17 times. Her eyes locked onto the old black janitor holding a mop, the man everyone had ignored for 3 years. The executives laughed. Cameras rolled. This was supposed to be a joke, a cruel lesson in knowing your place. But Frank Jackson set down his mop and walked toward the cockpit. What happened in the next 11 minutes would expose a secret buried for 3 years, destroy everything Victoria thought she knew about power, and force her to confront the ugliest truth about herself. If you want to see how one impossible moment changed everything, stay with me until the very end. And please hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The hangar smelled like hydraulic fluid, cold metal, and 3 years of failure. Victoria Ashford's heels cracked against the concrete like gunshots. Each step echoed through the cavernous space, bouncing off steel walls and dying somewhere in the shadows above. 27 people stood waiting for her, engineers in wrinkled shirts, executives in expensive suits, military consultants in pressed uniforms, and not a single one would meet her eyes. Good. They should be afraid. She stopped in the center of the hangar and let the silence stretch. Let them sweat. Let them feel what $400 million of wasted money felt like when it was sitting in their throats. The AH-7 Wraith gleamed under the harsh LED lights. Sleek curves, aggressive angles, matte black composite materials that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The rotor blades folded back like the wings of some sleeping predator. Beautiful, deadly, and completely, utterly useless. Someone, Victoria's voice cut through the silence, explain to me how we are 3 years and $400 million into development, and this machine still can't stay in the air for 7 minutes. Nobody moved. Dr. Chen. She turned toward the lead engineer. 6 months ago, you stood in my office. You looked me in the eye. You promised me the recalibration would fix the oscillation problem. You said we'd have a successful test by September. Marcus Chen gripped his tablet like it might save him. Victoria, the mathematics are sound. I don't pay you for mathematics. Her voice cracked like a whip. I pay you for results. The Pentagon has 5 other contractors circling this project like sharks. You know what sharks smell, Marcus? Blood. Our blood. If we had more time. Victoria laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. We've burned through 17 months of extensions. The Defense Department evaluation is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Marcus. And we have a $28 million sculpture that flies like a drunk flamingo. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group. Victoria's head snapped toward the sound. You think this is funny? You think your stock options are going to be funny when this company tanks? When you're all explaining to your next employer why the biggest military contract in a decade went to Lockheed instead of us? The laughter died instantly. James Whitmore, her VP of Operations, cleared his throat carefully. Victoria, perhaps if we approach the stabilization from a different angle. The issue might not be the gyroscopic system itself, but the integration with, I don't want theories. Victoria spun toward him. I want someone to get in that cockpit and fly this thing properly. Just once. One clean flight. That's all I need. One perfect demonstration to show the Pentagon we haven't wasted their money on an overpriced paperweight. Colonel Sarah Brennan, the military liaison, spoke quietly. The test pilots have all reported the same issues. The oscillation creates severe vertigo. The controls are hypersensitive. It's not a pilot problem. Then get me better pilots. Victoria was shouting now, her carefully cultivated corporate composure cracking like thin ice. Get me someone who isn't afraid of a little turbulence. This is supposed to be a combat helicopter. It's going to face hostile fire. Not just some wobbling. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the assembled group with undisguised disgust. These people. These highly paid, overeducated, credential-laden professionals who couldn't solve a problem that was costing millions of dollars a month. Her gaze swept across the hangar. past the engineers with their tablets, past the executives with their worried faces, past the observation area where assistants and junior staff clustered nervously. And then her eyes landed on him, an old man in gray coveralls, weathered brown skin, silver hair cropped close to his skull. Maybe 70, maybe older. He was pushing a mop bucket across the far end of the hangar, moving slowly, methodically, creating neat, overlapping patterns on the already clean floor. Victoria had seen him 100 times over the past 3 years. Maybe more. He was always there. Always working quietly in the background, emptying trash, cleaning windows, mopping floors. Part of the invisible infrastructure as unremarkable as the fluorescent lights or the climate control system. She didn't even know his name. And suddenly, in her fury and frustration, an idea bloomed. A terrible idea. A cruel idea. But also, in its own twisted way, a brilliant idea. If she couldn't motivate her team with reason or money or fear, maybe she could do it with shame. You know what? Victoria's voice changed. Something dangerous crept into it now. Something sharp and cold. Maybe we're going about this all wrong. Maybe we don't need more engineers or better pilots. Maybe what we need is some fresh perspective. Marcus looked up wearily. What do you mean? Victoria pointed across the hangar. Him. The janitor. The old man kept mopping. What's your name? Victoria called out. He stopped, looked up slowly. His dark eyes were calm, unreadable. For a moment he didn't respond, as if he couldn't quite believe she was addressing him. I asked you a question, Victoria said. Your name, Jackson, ma'am. His voice was deep and quiet, with the faint trace of a southern accent. Frank Jackson. Frank Jackson. Victoria smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd just spotted prey. Frank, how long have you worked here? 3 years, ma'am, since the building opened. 3 years. So you've been here since we brought the Wraith in. You've seen every test, every failure, every expensive disaster, haven't you? Frank set his mop against the bucket carefully. I've seen some things. Yes, ma'am. Victoria walked toward him. Her heels clicked with each step. The entire hangar watched this bizarre interaction unfold. Several people had their phones out now recording. This was going to make one hell of a story. Tell me something, Frank. Victoria stopped a few feet away from him. In your expert janitorial opinion, what do you think is wrong with our helicopter? A few snickers from the assembled executives. James Whitmore covered his mouth to hide a smile. Even Marcus looked relieved that Victoria's anger had found a new harmless target. Frank looked at her steadily. I wouldn't know about that, ma'am. I just clean the floors. Oh, but you must have some thoughts? Victoria's voice dripped with false sweetness. You're here all the time. You probably know this hangar better than anyone. Better than our engineers, certainly, since they can't seem to solve a simple stabilization problem. So please, share your wisdom with us. What would you do differently? The mockery was obvious now. Several people were openly grinning. Someone whispered something and laughter rippled through the group. Frank stood there, his weathered hands resting on the mop handle. He looked old, tired, completely out of place among these educated professionals in their expensive clothes. I'm just the janitor, ma'am, he repeated quietly. Exactly? Victoria spread her arms wide, her voice rising. Just the janitor. A man with a mop. No engineering degree, no flight training, no expertise whatsoever, and yet... She paused dramatically. I'm willing to bet that even you could do a better job than the so-called experts I've wasted millions paying. The laughter was louder now. This was entertaining. The Ice Queen CEO losing it on the janitor. People were definitely recording this. In fact, Victoria continued warming to her theme. I have an idea. A challenge. She stepped closer to Frank, close enough to see the lines around his eyes, close enough to smell the industrial cleaner on his coveralls. Frank Jackson, if you think you understand this helicopter so well from mopping around it, why don't you fly it? The laughter stopped. The silence was sudden, absolute. Frank looked at her without speaking. I'm serious, Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. You've had 3 years to observe, 3 years to watch these brilliant minds fail again and again. Surely you've learned something, so here's my offer. She held up her hand, fingers spread. You get that helicopter in the air. You fly it for 10 minutes without crashing, and I'll give you $100,000, cash. Victoria, this is insane. Marcus stepped forward. He could damage what? Victoria whirled on him. A machine that doesn't work. A prototype that's already failed 17 times. What exactly are we protecting here? Marcus? Our pride, our reputation. Those are already gone. She turned back to Frank. What do you say, Mr. Jackson? Want to earn $100,000? All you have to do is what our $1 million engineers can't accomplish. Just climb in, start it up, and fly. James Whitmore was grinning openly now. This is the best thing I've seen all year. Someone's recording this, right? Another executive asked. This is gold. Victoria held out her hand toward the helicopter like a game show host presenting a prize. Well, Frank, or are you going to admit that maybe, just maybe, flying a cutting-edge military helicopter is a bit more complicated than mopping floors? She was giving him an out, a chance to back down, a chance to acknowledge his place, to confirm what everyone in the room believed, that some people were meant to lead and innovate, while others were meant to clean up after them. Frank looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. Those dark eyes held something she couldn't quite identify. Not anger, not fear, not humiliation. Something else entirely. Then he leaned his mop against the wall. All right, he said quietly. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Victoria blinked. What? I said all right, ma'am. Frank's voice was calm, steady. I'll fly your helicopter. The laughter came back louder than before. This was perfect. The crazy CEO and the delusional janitor. This video was going to go viral inside the company. Frank, buddy. James started, still chuckling. I don't think you understand what you're... I understand fine. Frank began walking toward the Wraith. His gait was steady despite his age. His shoulders straight. His movements had a purpose that hadn't been there a moment ago. Victoria watched him approach the helicopter. A mixture of shock and satisfaction warred in her chest. This wasn't exactly how she'd planned it, but the result would be the same. He'd fumble with the controls, look foolish, and everyone would remember their place. This is ridiculous, Marcus muttered. We should stop this before... Before what? Victoria snapped. Before he exposes himself as incompetent. Let him. Let everyone see what happens when you overestimate yourself. Maybe it'll be a lesson. But something in Frank's movements was starting to bother her. He wasn't shuffling or hesitant. He moved with purpose. When he reached the Wraith, he didn't stop to gawk at it or look confused. He walked straight to the pilot side door and opened it with familiar ease. Victoria felt something cold flicker in her stomach. Has he opened that before? Colonel Brennan asked quietly. He cleans in here, someone offered. He probably knows where things are. Frank climbed into the cockpit, not struggled, not fumbled, climbed, smoothly, efficiently, like someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. He settled into the seat and reached for the harness. The 4-point harness clicked into place with practiced precision. Victoria's mouth went dry. Frank's hands moved across the control panel, not randomly, not searching. He flipped 3 switches in quick succession, and the Wraith systems hummed to life. Displays lit up. The main computer began its startup sequence. How does he... James trailed off. Frank reached overhead and adjusted the collective pitch. Then he tested the cyclic, moving it through a small range of motion. His movements were economical, professional. This wasn't a janitor playing pretend. This was something else entirely. Victoria! Colonel Brennan's voice was sharp now. I think we should... Victoria held up her hand. She was staring at Frank, really looking at him for the first time. The way he sat in the cockpit. The way his hands knew exactly where every control was. The calm, focused expression on his weathered face. "Engine start sequence," Frank said, and his voice came through the hangar's communication system. Clear. Authoritative. "Turbine 1. The first engine coughed, then caught, then roared to life with a deep, powerful sound that vibrated through the hangar floor. "Turbine 2. The second engine joined the first. The rotor blades began their slow rotation overhead. Every phone in the hangar was up now, every camera recording. But nobody was laughing anymore. Oil pressure nominal." Frank's voice continued calmly over the speakers. "Hydraulics green, fuel flow optimal, rotor RPM building to operational speed." He sounded like a pilot, not like a pilot, like a very good pilot. Victoria's heart began to pound. "Generator output stable. Avionics online. Flight control system initialized." Frank's right hand rested on the cyclic, his left on the collective, his feet positioned on the anti-torque pedals with the easy confidence of long familiarity. "Someone stop this!" Marcus shouted. But it was too late. The Wraith lifted off the ground. It rose smoothly, steadily, with none of the wobbling or oscillation that had plagued every previous test. 1 foot, 2 feet, 5, 10. The landing skids cleared the safety markers on the floor, and still the helicopter rose, perfectly balanced, perfectly controlled. 20 feet up, Frank brought the Wraith into a stable hover. The hangar fell silent except for the thunder of the turbines and the rhythmic beat of the rotor blades cutting through the air. Victoria stared upward, her hand pressed to her mouth. "That's impossible," James breathed. "The stabilization system can't..." Frank banked the helicopter to the left. Not dramatically, just a smooth, controlled banking turn that brought the nose around to face the opposite direction. The movement was surgical in its precision. Then he accelerated forward. The Wraith shot across the length of the hangar with startling speed. Victoria's heart leaped into her throat as she imagined it crashing into the far wall. But 30 feet from impact, Frank pulled back on the cyclic and simultaneously increased collective pitch. The helicopter came to a perfect deceleration that stopped its forward momentum exactly where he wanted it. "Stabilization holding," Frank's voice said over the speakers. "Oscillation within acceptable parameters, compensating for minor pitch variation with cyclic input." He was narrating his flight, explaining what he was doing, and worse, explaining it in technical terms that made perfect sense. "Who is this guy?" Colonel Brennan demanded. For the next 20 minutes, Frank Jackson put the Wraith through maneuvers that Victoria had never seen before. Not from their test pilots, not from the military consultants, not from anyone. He executed a nose-down attitude change that sent the helicopter diving at a steep angle before pulling up smoothly. He performed a pedal turn using only the anti-torque pedals to spin the helicopter on its axis while maintaining perfect altitude. He did a sideways translation, moving the entire aircraft laterally across the hangar without changing its facing. Every movement was controlled, precise, professional. And more than that, they revealed something about the Wraith that none of the previous flights had shown. The helicopter could do things, aggressive things, combat things. In Frank Jackson's hands, the Wraith wasn't a temperamental prototype that could barely stay airborne. It was a weapon, fast, maneuverable, absolutely lethal looking as it carved through the air. "Look at the stabilization system," Marcus whispered, his eyes glued to his tablet. "He's not fighting it, he's working with it, using the oscillation instead of trying to suppress it." "How long has he been up?" someone asked. James checked his watch, his face pale. 8 minutes. 8 minutes without a single problem. Frank brought the Wraith back to center, hovering at exactly 15 feet. Then, and Victoria would never forget this moment, he performed a maneuver that she'd only seen in combat footage from overseas. He dropped the collective completely, while simultaneously kicking the tail around with the pedals, sending the helicopter into a controlled auto-rotation spin. The Wraith descended rapidly, rotating on its axis. The maneuver designed to avoid ground fire, while descending quickly to a landing zone. 5 feet from the ground, Frank arrested the descent with a perfectly timed collective pull. The Wraith settled onto its skids as gently as a falling leaf. The engines wound down. The rotors began to slow, and in the sudden relative quiet, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Frank Jackson unbuckled his harness, removed his helmet, and climbed out of the cockpit with the same easy efficiency he'd shown climbing in. He walked back across the hangar floor, past the stunned executives, past the frozen engineers, past Colonel Brennan, whose mouth hung open. He walked to where his mop and bucket waited, and he picked up his mop. 10 minutes and 47 seconds, he said quietly. No incidents. Helicopters in perfect condition. Same as when I started. He looked at Victoria. His dark eyes met hers. Will that be cash or check, ma'am? Victoria couldn't breathe. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Around her, 27 professionals stood in shocked silence, their phones still recording, their mouths hanging open. Who are you? The words came out as barely a whisper. Frank looked at her with those calm, dark eyes. Eyes that suddenly seemed to contain depths she'd never noticed before. Like I said, ma'am, just the janitor. No. Colonel Brennan stepped forward, her military bearing sharp with suspicion. And something else. Recognition. No janitor flies like that. I've seen combat pilots with 20 years of experience who couldn't execute half those maneuvers. So I'll ask you again, who are you? Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was still calm. But there was something in it now. Something that had been absent before. A weight. An authority. My name is Frank Jackson, he said. Colonel Frank Jackson. United States Army retired. 28 years of service. 3,000 hours flying attack helicopters in combat zones. Another 2,000 hours as a test pilot and instructor at Fort Rucker. The silence in the hangar was so complete that Victoria could hear her own heartbeat. I helped develop the flight control systems for the Apache, the Comanche, and about 6 other platforms you've never heard of because they're still classified. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. I retired 12 years ago, Frank continued. Full honors. Then my wife got sick. Cancer. The kind that takes years to kill you and costs everything you have trying to stop it. His voice remained steady, factual, like he was reciting mission parameters instead of describing the destruction of his life. We burned through our savings in 18 months, lost the house in 2 years. By the time she died, I was $300,000 in debt from medical bills. Victoria's hands began to shake. I took this job 3 years ago because at 71 years old with 6-figure debt and no collateral, this was what I could get. Night shift janitor. Cleaning floors in a building full of people who looked right through me like I was furniture. He looked around the hangar, at all the phones, all the recording devices, all the shocked faces. And that was fine. I didn't need to be seen. I just needed to pay off debt and have enough left over for food. His eyes came back to Victoria. But I never stopped being a pilot, and I never stopped paying attention. He took a step toward her. For 3 years I watched you people struggle with a helicopter that any competent test pilot could have diagnosed in 10 minutes. I listened to your engineers argue about problems that had simple solutions. I saw you waste millions of dollars and thousands of hours because everyone was so focused on the complex possibilities that they ignored the simple realities. He gestured toward the Wraith with his free hand. Your stabilization system isn't broken, Ms. Ashford. It's designed for aggressive combat maneuvering. It creates controlled oscillation to allow faster attitude changes. But your test pilots were trying to fly it like a civilian aircraft, smooth and stable. They were fighting the very thing that makes this helicopter special. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. The oscillation is intentional. Not entirely. There's still a calibration issue in the pitch axis that needs addressing. But yes, fundamentally you built a scalpel, and then complained that it wasn't a butter knife. Frank turned back to Victoria. You want to know the worst part, Ms. Ashford? His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent hangar like thunder. I tried to tell someone. 6 months ago. I wrote up a detailed analysis and left it on Dr. Chen's desk. Explained the flight dynamics. Suggested modified training protocols. Even drew diagrams. Marcus's face went white. The janitor's note. I thought it was a joke. I threw it away without reading past the first page. I know. Frank's expression didn't change. I saw you do it. The words hung in the air like an accusation. That's when I stopped trying. If you wanted to waste your money and your time, that was your choice. I had floors to mop. Victoria felt tears stinging her eyes. Hot, burning. Shame like she hadn't felt since childhood. 3 years, she whispered. 3 years you've been here. And you never looked. Frank's voice was gentle now, almost kind. None of you did. You saw the coveralls and the mop and you decided what I was worth, what I could possibly know. He looked around at the assembled executives, the engineers, the military consultants. You asked me to fly your helicopter as a joke, Ms. Ashford, to humiliate me, to make your engineers feel better about their failures by comparison. Victoria couldn't deny it, couldn't defend herself, because it was true. And I did it, Frank continued, because I'm tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of watching people fail because they're too proud to listen. And mostly tired of pretending that mopping floors is all I'm good for just because the world decided my experience doesn't matter anymore. He picked up his mop bucket. The helicopter works fine, Ms. Ashford. You just needed someone who knew how to fly it properly. He began pushing the bucket toward the exit. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a spill in conference room B that needs addressing. Wait. Victoria's voice cracked. Frank, please, wait. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. Victoria stood in the middle of the hangar surrounded by her expensive team and their expensive failures, and felt the full weight of what she'd done pressing down on her chest. I'm sorry, she said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate even as she spoke them. I'm so sorry, for all of it. The way I spoke to you, the assumptions, I don't need your apology, ma'am. Frank's voice was quiet, tired. I need my paycheck every 2 weeks. That's all I've ever needed from this place. What if I could offer you something better? The words tumbled out before Victoria had fully formed the thought. What if I offered you a position, a real position on the flight test team, or the engineering department? You clearly know more about this helicopter than anyone in this building. Name your price. Name your position. I'll make it happen. Frank stood there for a long moment, his back still to her. When he finally turned around, his expression was unreadable. You want me to help fix your helicopter, save your contract, make you look good to the Pentagon. His voice was flat. That's what this is about. Not about treating people with dignity, not about recognizing value regardless of job title, just about winning. No, that's not. Victoria stopped. Was it? Even now, was she just trying to turn this disaster into a victory? Use him the same way she'd tried to use him as a punchline, Ms. Ashford. Frank's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. You have a room full of talented people here. Smart people. People who could have solved this problem months ago if they'd been willing to listen to ideas from unexpected places. He gestured to the assembled executives and engineers. Your problem isn't lack of expertise, it's lack of humility. Every person in this hangar was so focused on their credentials, their positions, their importance, that they couldn't imagine a janitor might know something valuable. And because you created a culture where only certain people's voices matter, you wasted millions and nearly destroyed this project. Victoria looked around at her team. Marcus wouldn't meet her eyes. James was staring at his shoes. Colonel Brennan looked thoughtful, but troubled. "You want to fix your helicopter?" Frank asked. "Start by fixing your culture. Start by actually listening to people. All people. The young engineer who's afraid to speak up in meetings. The technician who's been doing this work for 20 years but doesn't have a degree. The guy mopping the floors who used to design the systems you're struggling with." He paused. "And maybe, just maybe, start by paying people what they're worth instead of what you think you can get away with. I make $18 an hour cleaning your floors. The kid who empties the trash cans makes 15. Meanwhile, you're in here crying about millions in failed tests." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. "If I accept your offer," Frank said slowly, "it won't be as a special exception. It won't be as the token old guy you bring in to fix one problem. It'll be as part of a real change in how this company operates. Fair wages across the board, real respect for every position, and actual accountability starting from the top." Victoria took a deep breath. What he was asking for would require board approval, budget reallocation, a complete shift in company culture and philosophy. It would be expensive, complicated, difficult. It would also be right. "Okay," she said. Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. "Okay. Okay, yes, okay." Victoria heard her own voice as if from a distance. "You're hired. Not just as a consultant or a temporary fix. Director of Flight Operations, Chief Test Pilot, whatever position makes sense, whatever salary you need. And the other changes. We'll start with an immediate audit of all wages and positions. I want to know who's being underpaid and by how much. And I want a plan on my desk in 2 weeks for bringing everyone up to fair market value." Frank studied her carefully. "You understand this will cost millions. Less than we've wasted on failed tests because we were too proud to listen." Victoria met his eyes. "Less than we'll lose if this contract falls through. And more importantly, it's what we should have been doing all along. For the first time since this whole surreal encounter began." Frank smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, but genuine. "Then we have a deal, Ms. Ashford." He extended his hand. Victoria shook it. His grip was firm, calloused from years of work both in cockpits and with cleaning equipment. Around them, the assembled crowd began to react, some applauding, some still too shocked to move, some clearly calculating what this meant for their own positions and futures. Victoria raised her voice. "I want everyone to think very carefully about what just happened here. We were about to lose everything because we couldn't see what was right in front of us, because we made assumptions based on appearances and positions instead of actual knowledge and skill." She gestured to Frank. "Colonel Jackson, because that's how I'm going to think of him from now on, just save this project. Maybe save this company. Not because he's smarter than all of you, but because he was willing to see clearly what we'd all missed. And he could only do that because he wasn't invested in protecting his ego or his position." She turned back to Frank. "When can you start?" Frank looked down at his mop, then back at her. "Well," he said, "I still have about 4 hours left on my shift, and there's that spill in conference room B. I'll handle the spill." James volunteered quickly. "Least I can do." "Then I suppose I can start Monday." Frank nodded slowly. "Give me the weekend to process what I've apparently just agreed to." "Monday it is." Victoria took a breath. "And Frank, thank you. For the flight. For the honesty. For giving us a chance to be better than we've been." "Just doing what needs doing, ma'am." Frank picked up his mop one last time. "Same as always." He turned and walked away, leaving his bucket behind. Victoria watched him go, this man who had been invisible to her for 3 years, this decorated colonel, this expert pilot, this human being she had tried to humiliate for sport, and she wondered how many other Frank Jacksons were out there, pushing mops, emptying trash, holding expertise and wisdom and value that the world had decided didn't matter anymore. She wondered, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than the cold satisfaction of winning. She felt ashamed. And strangely, impossibly, she felt hope. The weekend passed like a fever dream. Victoria didn't sleep Friday night. She sat in her home office until 3 in the morning watching the video on her phone over and over again. Someone had uploaded it to YouTube within hours of leaving the hangar. By midnight, it had 50,000 views. By dawn, it had crossed 500,000. The comments were brutal. CEO gets destroyed by janitor. Love to see it. This is what's wrong with corporate America. They ignore the people who actually know things. That old man is a legend. Give him everything he deserves. She should be fired. Disgusting behavior. Victoria read every single one. She deserved them all. Her phone rang at 6 in the morning. James Whitmore. Have you seen the numbers? His voice was tight with panic. The video is everywhere. Business Insider picked it up. Forbes is asking for a comment. 3 board members have already called me demanding to know what's going on. What did you tell them? That you'd handle it. Victoria, we need to get ahead of this. We need a PR strategy, damage control, something. Victoria stared at the video paused on her screen. Frank's face calm and dignified as he climbed into the cockpit. Her own face twisted with cruel amusement, pointing at him like he was a circus act. No, she said. No, Victoria, this could destroy the company. The Pentagon is going to see this. Our investors are going to see this. We look like exactly what we were. Victoria's voice was steady. Arrogant, blind, cruel. And trying to spin that or hide it would only make it worse. Then what do you suggest? I suggest we tell the truth. We were failing. We got called out. We're changing. That's the story. James was silent for a long moment. The board isn't going to like this. Then they can fire me. She hung up before he could respond. The board meeting happened Sunday afternoon. Emergency session. 7 members present in person, 5 on video conference. Victoria walked into the room knowing she might walk out without a job. This is a disaster, Richard Caldwell said before she'd even sat down. He was the longest-serving board member, a man who'd made his fortune in defense contracting and believed that workers were interchangeable parts. The stock is going to tank tomorrow. We're going to lose the Pentagon contract. And for what? Because you decided to humiliate some janitor, and it backfired. I did humiliate him, Victoria said calmly, and he turned out to be more qualified than anyone else in the building. That's not a PR problem, Richard. That's a leadership problem. My leadership problem. So you admit you made a mistake. I admit I've been making mistakes for 10 years. Victoria pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. That's a preliminary wage audit. I had HR pull it together yesterday. 40% of our employees are paid below market rate. The janitorial staff makes $18 an hour in a city where the living wage is $24. We have engineers with 20 years of experience making less than new hires because they didn't know how to negotiate. Caldwell barely glanced at the folder. What does this have to do with anything? It has to do with everything. Victoria stood up. We built a culture where certain people matter and others don't, where credentials trump competence, where the person mopping the floors couldn't possibly know anything valuable even if he spent 30 years flying military helicopters. She looked around the table. Frank Jackson tried to help us 6 months ago. He wrote a detailed technical analysis explaining exactly what was wrong with the Wraith. And one of our engineers threw it in the trash without reading it because it came from a janitor. That's unfortunate, Caldwell said. But I don't see how. We wasted 6 months and $40 million because we couldn't imagine that someone in coveralls might know something. Victoria's voice rose. That's not just unfortunate, Richard. That's institutional failure. And I created that institution. Margaret Thompson, one of the newer board members, leaned forward. What are you proposing, Victoria? I'm proposing we fix it, starting with Colonel Jackson. Yes, Colonel, he outranks half the military consultants we've been paying as Director of Flight Operations. Then company-wide wage corrections. Then a complete overhaul of how we evaluate ideas, regardless of where they come from. That will cost millions, Caldwell said flatly. It will cost less than we've already wasted. And it will cost a hell of a lot less than losing the Pentagon contract because our culture is too broken to solve problems. The room was silent. Victoria took a breath. If you want to fire me, fire me. But if you give me the chance to fix this, I will. Starting tomorrow. The vote took 45 minutes. 8 in favor of keeping Victoria and implementing changes. 4 opposed, including Caldwell. It was enough. Monday morning arrived with a weight that Victoria had never felt before. Not the weight of failure she'd carried that for 3 years. This was different. This was the weight of trying to become someone better than she'd been. She arrived at the facility at 6:30 and found Frank already there. He was standing in the hangar, looking up at the Wraith, wearing the same gray coveralls he'd worn for 3 years. Victoria stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain what to say. "You're early," she finally managed. "Habit." Frank didn't look away from the helicopter. "Spent 30 years getting up before dawn. Body doesn't know how to sleep late anymore. I have something for you." Victoria held out a folder. Employment contract. Director of Flight Operations. The salary we discussed, plus benefits, plus a signing bonus that should cover your remaining medical debt. Frank took the folder, but didn't open it. "You looked into my finances. I needed to understand what you were carrying. I hope that's not... It's practical." He almost smiled. "I appreciate practical. There's also something else." Victoria hesitated. "I owe you an apology, a real one. Not the panicked thing I said Friday when I realized what I'd done, but... Ms. Ashford." "Victoria. Please." Frank nodded slowly. "Victoria, you don't owe me anything except what's in this contract. What happened Friday that wasn't personal? I've been invisible to people like you my whole life. In the military, they respected me because they had to. But out here, I'm just an old black man with a mop. People see what they expect to see." "That's not good enough." Victoria's voice cracked. "You deserved better. Not just from me, from this whole company. From the HR department that rejected your application. From the engineer who threw away your analysis. From everyone who walked past you for 3 years without wondering if there was more to your story." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her directly. "My wife used to say that people are like helicopters, capable of more than anyone thinks, but only if the conditions are right." He paused. "You're trying to create the right conditions. That matters more than any apology." Victoria felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "I don't know if I can actually change. I've been this way for so long." Change isn't about knowing. It's about choosing. Every day. Every decision. Frank finally opened the contract folder. "You chose to listen to me Friday instead of doubling down on your cruelty. You chose to face your board instead of hiding. You're choosing right now to have this conversation instead of just throwing money at the problem." He pulled out a pen and signed the contract. "That's enough for me to take a chance on you." Victoria took the signed contract with hands that weren't quite steady. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I'm not going to go easy on anyone, including you. If we're going to fix this company, it's going to hurt." "I know." "Good." Frank looked at his watch. "Staff meeting is at 10, right? I need to review the flight data from the last 6 months before then. And I want to see the personnel files on all the test pilots. I'll have everything sent to your office." "My office." Frank shook his head slowly. 3 days ago, I was cleaning toilets. Now I have an office." "You should have had one all along." "Maybe. But I didn't. And there are a lot of people out there like me, people who should have offices, should have respect, should have someone listening to them. Don't forget that when this gets hard." Victoria nodded. "I won't." Frank headed toward the administrative building, and Victoria watched him go. His gait was steady, his shoulders straight. The same man who'd pushed a mop bucket through this hangar for 3 years, but somehow completely transformed. Or maybe he'd always been this. Maybe she just hadn't been able to see it. The staff meeting started at 10 sharp. Every seat in the main conference room was filled. Engineers, executives, technicians, administrative staff, even some of the janitorial crew that Frank used to work alongside. Word had spread fast about what was happening, and everyone wanted to see it for themselves. Victoria stood at the head of the table with Frank beside her. She could feel the tension in the room. Fear, uncertainty, resentment. Some people were here because they believed in what was happening. Others were here because they wanted to watch it fail. "Thank you all for coming," Victoria began. "I know many of you have seen the video from Friday. I know there are questions, concerns, probably some fear about what happens next. So let me be direct." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Everything is changing, starting today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Colonel Frank Jackson is now Director of Flight Operations. He has full authority over all testing protocols, pilot training, and flight system development. His decisions in those areas are final." Marcus Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Victoria noticed, but didn't acknowledge it. "I know this is sudden. I know some of you are wondering how someone who was cleaning floors on Friday can be running operations on Monday. So let me tell you what I should have known 3 years ago." She proceeded to detail Frank's military record, his experience as a test pilot, his role in developing flight systems for multiple helicopter platforms. With each credential, the murmuring grew quieter. By the time she finished, the room was silent. "For 3 years, Victoria said, we had one of the most qualified helicopter pilots in the country working in this building, and we had him mopping floors because we never bothered to look beyond his job title, because we made assumptions about who was valuable and who wasn't." She let that sink in. "That ends now. Starting today, we're implementing an open-door policy for ideas from anyone in this organization. I don't care if you're a senior engineer or you empty the trash cans. If you have an idea, a concern, a solution, you bring it forward and it will be heard." James Whitmore spoke up from the back. "With respect, Victoria, we can't evaluate every random suggestion from every employee. We'd never get anything done." "You're right. We can't. Which is why Colonel Jackson is going to establish a review process that's efficient but accessible." Victoria paused. "But here's the key difference. We're going to approach every idea with the assumption that the person bringing it forward might know something we don't. Novel concept." "I know." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Frank stepped forward. "Let me be clear about something. I'm not here to replace anyone or make enemies. Dr. Chen, your engineering is sound. Mr. Whitmore, your project management has kept us on track even when the technical side struggled. Colonel Brennan, your military insights are invaluable." He looked around the room. "But we've all been failing because we stopped communicating honestly. Engineers were afraid to admit when they were stuck. Pilots were afraid to report problems that might make them look incompetent. Management was so focused on appearances that they missed the substance." Marcus found his voice. "Colonel Jackson, with respect, some of us did raise concerns about the flight characteristics. I personally wrote 3 reports about the stabilization issues. I read them." Frank's voice was calm. "All 3. They were technically accurate. They were also completely wrong in their conclusions." The room tensed. "You approached the oscillation as a problem to be eliminated. You never considered that it might be intentional. And you know why? Because you were so invested in being right about your original assumptions that you couldn't see alternatives." Marcus's face flushed. "That's not fair. When that janitor me left a detailed analysis on your desk explaining the actual flight dynamics, what did you do with it?" Silence. "I threw it away," Marcus said quietly. "I didn't think it was credible. It was handwritten notes from someone with no visible credentials." "No visible credentials," Frank corrected. "You never asked who I was or where my knowledge came from. You just assumed that because I pushed a mop, I couldn't possibly understand helicopter aerodynamics better than you." Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "I made a mistake." "Yes, and if I'm going to work here, we all need to be able to admit our mistakes without fear of being destroyed for them." Frank's voice softened. "Marcus, your work is genuinely good. The Wraith's design is brilliant. But brilliance without humility is just arrogance. And arrogance gets people killed when they're flying complex machines in combat situations." He turned back to the room. "Here's how this is going to work. Tomorrow we're starting fresh flight tests. I'll be in the cockpit for the first 3 runs demonstrating proper technique. Then I'll begin training sessions for all our test pilots, showing them how to work with the aircraft instead of against it. Dr. Chen and his team will observe and take notes. We'll identify the remaining technical issues, and yes, there are some, and we'll fix them together." Someone called out from the middle of the room. "What about the Pentagon evaluation? We've got 5 weeks." 4 weeks and 6 days, Colonel Brennan corrected quietly. "Then we have 4 weeks and 6 days to turn this prototype into a combat-ready platform." Frank's voice was steady. "It's tight, but it's doable if we work together and stop wasting time on politics and ego." Victoria stepped forward again. "One more thing. Starting next week, we're implementing wage corrections. Everyone will receive a letter detailing any adjustments to their compensation. For some of you, it will be significant. For others, it will be minimal. But the goal is to ensure that pay reflects actual value and contribution, not just position or tenure." James pushed off from the wall. "Can we afford that? We're already over budget on this project." "We can't afford not to." Victoria's voice was firm. "Every dollar we save by underpaying people costs us tenfold in turnover resentment and lost productivity. I'd rather run lean at the top than create a permanent underclass at the bottom." "Does that include executive compensation?" Victoria met his eyes. "I'm taking a 20% salary cut, and I'm asking the executive team to consider voluntary reductions as well. That money goes into the wage correction fund." The room erupted in shocked conversation. Taking pay cuts was not something executives did. "That's insane," James said flatly. "You'll lose half your leadership team." "Then they weren't the right leaders." Frank's voice cut through the noise. "Any leader who won't sacrifice for their people isn't worth following." The meeting broke up slowly. People clustered in small groups discussing what they'd just heard. Victoria noticed Marcus approaching Frank hesitantly. "Colonel Jackson, I owe you an apology for the note, for not taking you seriously, for doing what almost everyone does when they see someone in a service position." Frank finished the sentence for him. "I understand, Dr. Chen. I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for collaboration moving forward." "You'll have it." Marcus extended his hand. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. We needed someone who wasn't afraid to tell us we were wrong." They shook hands. Victoria felt a small knot of tension release in her chest. This might actually work. The flight tests began at 7:15 the next morning. Frank stood in the hangar briefing area with 8 test pilots gathered around him. 6 from Meridian's team, 2 military consultants on loan from Fort Rucker. These were experienced aviators who'd logged thousands of hours in everything from Blackhawks to Apaches. And Frank was about to tell them they'd been flying the Wraith all wrong. "The first thing you need to understand," he began, "is that this aircraft was designed by people who understood combat aerodynamics but failed to communicate that understanding to the people flying it. The result is a machine that feels dangerous when it's actually just different." One of the civilian pilots, a former Navy aviator named Rodriguez, raised his hand. "Colonel, with respect, I've flown the Wraith 3 times. It's not different, it's unstable. The oscillation makes it impossible to maintain steady flight." "That's because you're trying to maintain steady flight in an aircraft designed for dynamic maneuvering." Frank pulled up a video of his flight from Friday. Someone had synced the footage with the Wraith's telemetry data. "Watch the oscillation pattern during this banking turn." The video played. The telemetry overlay showed the stabilization system deliberately reducing dampening during the turn, allowing faster attitude change, then automatically compensating as the maneuver completed. See that spike in the lateral axis? That's not a malfunction. That's the flight control computer briefly sacrificing stability for agility. In combat, that extra half-second of turn time is the difference between evading hostile fire and getting shot down. Rodriguez leaned forward, studying the data. So, the system is designed to be temporarily unstable. Controlled instability. Like a sports car that oversteers intentionally to allow tighter cornering. But if you try to drive it like a sedan, you'll spin out. Same principle here. Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the military liaison team spoke up. Colonel Jackson, I flew combat missions in Afghanistan. I understand aggressive flying. But the Wraith's oscillation triggers severe vertigo. That's not just discomfort, that's a safety issue. You're absolutely right, Frank acknowledged. And that's the calibration problem I mentioned. The oscillation frequency is slightly off-spec in the pitch axis, which creates a resonance effect that interferes with the inner ear. Dr. Chen's team is working on the fix, but even with that issue, the vertigo is manageable if you understand what's causing it. He advanced to the next slide, a modified heads-up display overlay. This is a new HUD configuration I designed yesterday. It provides real-time oscillation feedback and predictive attitude indicators. Essentially, it shows you where the aircraft is going to be, not just where it is now. That gives your brain the information it needs to compensate for the sensory confusion. The pilots exchanged glances. This was more than just flying technique. This was a fundamental rethinking of how they interfaced with the aircraft. Here's the training plan, Frank continued. I'll fly first, demonstrating baseline maneuvers. Then each of you will fly with me in the co-pilot seat while I talk you through the technique. We'll start with basic hover and translation, then progress to more aggressive maneuvers over the next 2 weeks. By the time the Pentagon evaluation team arrives, I want every one of you comfortable pushing this aircraft to its limits. Rodriguez raised his hand again. Colonel, no disrespect, but you're 74 years old. Are you sure you should be flying combat maneuvers in a prototype helicopter? The question hung in the air. Frank's expression didn't change, but Victoria, watching from the observation area above, saw something flicker in his eyes. A brief flash of the same anger he must have felt every day while mopping floors. Being dismissed because of his age. That's a fair question. Frank's voice was even. I'm 74. I have arthritis in both hands. My reaction time is slower than it was 20 years ago. My vision isn't what it used to be. All valid concerns. He walked to the window overlooking the hangar floor where the Wraith sat waiting. But I've also got 50 years of flying experience. I've logged more combat hours than everyone in this room combined. I've tested aircraft that killed pilots who made single mistakes. And I learned from every close call, every failure, every success. He turned back to face them. Age takes away speed, but it gives you something more valuable. Judgment. His voice carried absolute conviction. I'm not asking you to follow me because I'm the fastest or the strongest. I'm asking you to follow me because I know what I'm doing, and I can teach you to know what you're doing too. And if you think age disqualifies competence, then you learned the wrong lessons from whatever happened last Friday. The room was silent. Then Lieutenant Kim stood up. I'll fly with you, Colonel. Let's see what this bird can really do. One by one, the other pilots nodded their agreement. Even Rodriguez, though he still looked skeptical. Frank checked his watch. Good. Pre-flight begins in 10 minutes. Rodriguez, you're observing first. Kim, you're up second. Questions? There were none. Victoria watched from above as the briefing broke up and the pilots headed for the hangar floor. Marcus stood beside her, his tablet forgotten. He's magnificent, Marcus said quietly. I've been trying to explain the stabilization theory to pilots for 6 months. He just did it in 15 minutes. That's what happens when you combine expertise with humility, Victoria replied. He's not trying to prove he's smarter than them. He's trying to make them better. I should have read that note. Yes, you should have. But we're past that now. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Victoria, I've been thinking about what Frank said, about creating a culture where only certain voices matter. I did that too, in my department. There's a junior engineer, Amy Chen, no relation, who suggested the oscillation might be a feature months ago. I dismissed her because she'd only been here a year. Was she right? She was closer than any of us. Marcus shook his head. I need to apologize to her. And I need to figure out how many other ideas I've dismissed because they came from the wrong person. Victoria put her hand on his shoulder. That's the whole point, Marcus. We all need to figure that out. Every single one of us. The first test flight began 20 minutes later. Frank's voice came through the speakers as he lifted the Wraith off the ground. Calm, professional, narrating every movement for the watching pilots. Notice the slight lag between control input and aircraft response. That's the stabilization system doing its job. If you fight it, you create a feedback loop. If you work with it, it's smooth as glass. Victoria watched as the helicopter executed a series of maneuvers that would have been impossible 3 days ago. Banking turns, rapid attitude changes, combat evasion techniques. And through it all, Frank's voice remained steady. Teaching, guiding, transforming fear into understanding. Rodriguez watched with his arms crossed, his skepticism slowly giving way to something else. Respect. Holy hell! Lieutenant Kim breathed as Frank executed a particularly aggressive diving maneuver before pulling up smoothly. I tried that exact move 2 weeks ago, nearly crashed. That's because you pulled back on the cyclic too early. Frank's voice responded over the speakers, apparently hearing her through the open channel. You have to let the nose drop fully before initiating the climb. Otherwise, you're fighting the momentum. Trust the aircraft. When the test flight ended, the touchdown was so gentle that the skids barely made a sound against the concrete. Frank climbed out of the cockpit, looking tired but satisfied. The watching crowd, engineers, pilots, technicians, burst into spontaneous applause. That's enough for today, Frank said quietly. Tomorrow we start training in earnest. Get some rest. You're going to need it. Victoria caught his eye across the hangar. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement of shared purpose. They had 4 weeks and 5 days left. And for the first time in 3 years, Victoria actually believed they might succeed. Not because they had better technology or bigger budgets, but because they'd finally started listening to the people they'd been ignoring all along. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of jet fuel, sleepless nights, and small victories that added up to something larger than anyone had expected. Frank worked 18-hour days. Victoria had to forcibly send him home 3 times when she noticed him struggling with fatigue, his weathered hands shaking as he reviewed flight data long after midnight. His body wasn't keeping up with his mind's demands, but his determination never wavered. You're going to kill yourself, she told him on the Thursday of the second week, finding him in the hangar at 2 a.m. I've been dying slowly for 12 years. Frank didn't look up from his tablet. At least now I'm dying for something that matters. That's not funny. It's not meant to be. He finally met her eyes. Victoria, I watched my wife fade away over 4 years. I held her hand while she took her last breath. I buried her with money I didn't have, then spent the next 8 years trying to figure out why I was still alive when she wasn't. Victoria didn't know what to say. She stood there in the empty hangar, the Wraith looming behind them like a sleeping giant, and felt the weight of Frank's grief settle into her own chest. Mopping floors gave me something to do, Frank continued quietly. A reason to get up. A paycheck that kept me from being homeless. But it wasn't living. It was just existing. Waiting for the end. He set down the tablet. This what we're doing here, this is the first time in years I've felt like myself again. Like the man I was before everything fell apart. So if I work myself to death in the process, at least, I'll die being who I actually am, instead of who the world decided I should be. Victoria sat down beside him. Tell me about her. Your wife. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Her name was Eleanor. Ellie. We met in 1978 at Fort Bragg. She was a nurse in the base hospital. I came in with a broken arm from a training accident, and she told me I was the worst patient she'd ever had. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I asked her to marry me 6 weeks later. She said no, said I was too reckless, too stubborn, too convinced I was invincible. So I spent the next year proving I could be better, learning to listen, learning to slow down, learning that strength isn't about never being afraid, it's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was everything. Frank's voice cracked slightly. 42 years of marriage, 3 children, a life I never deserved but got anyway. And then cancer came and none of it mattered. All my training, all my experience, all my so-called courage, I couldn't save her. I couldn't even make it easier. I just had to watch. Victoria felt tears running down her cheeks. She didn't try to wipe them away. When she died, I disappeared. Cut off my kids because I was too ashamed to let them see what I'd become. Told myself I was protecting them, but really, I was just protecting my pride. Couldn't stand the thought of my children seeing their father as a failure. You're not a failure, Frank. I know that now. But it took a long time to figure out. He picked up the tablet again. That's why this matters so much. Not the contract, not the money, not even the helicopters. It matters because it's proof that it's never too late to be who you were meant to be. That invisibility isn't permanent. That the world can change its mind about you if you're willing to change first. They sat in silence for a while. The hangar hummed with the quiet sounds of climate control and distant machinery. My daughter called yesterday, Frank said finally. Sarah. First time we've spoken in 8 years. Victoria's heart clenched. How did she find you? The video. Someone sent it to her. She recognized me immediately, even after all this time. His voice was thick with emotion. She cried for 20 minutes before she could even form words. Asked me why I never told her I was struggling, why I shut her out, why I let her believe her father had just abandoned them. What did you say? The truth. That I was ashamed. That I loved her too much to let her see me broken. That I made the worst decision of my life thinking I was doing the right thing. Frank's hands trembled. She's flying in next weekend, bringing my granddaughter, Emma. She's 7 years old and I've never even seen a picture of her. Victoria reached over and took his hand. His grip was firm despite the trembling. That's what this is really about, she said quietly. Not the Pentagon, not the company. This is about second chances. For all of us. Frank squeezed her hand briefly, then let go. Now go home. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. The training continued. Every pilot who flew with Frank came away transformed. Rodriguez, the skeptical Navy veteran, became one of his most dedicated students. Lieutenant Kim requested an extension of her military liaison assignment specifically to continue learning. Even the civilian pilots who'd initially resented Frank's rapid promotion now sought his guidance on everything from technical questions to career advice. How do you do it? Marcus asked Frank one afternoon, watching another successful test flight from the observation deck. They were ready to dismiss you as a joke. Now they'd follow you anywhere. I don't ask them to follow me, Frank replied. I show them how to be better than they were yesterday. That's not leadership, that's teaching. And teaching isn't about making yourself look good. It's about making your students succeed. The engineering team made progress too. Working directly with Frank instead of through layers of bureaucracy, they identified and fixed the remaining technical issues with startling efficiency. The pitch axis calibration that had plagued every previous test was corrected in 4 days. The fuel flow problem that Frank had noticed during his first inspection was resolved in 2. I can't believe we missed this, Marcus said, staring at the data. It was right there in front of us the whole time. You were looking for complex problems, Frank told him. Sometimes the answer is simple. You just have to be willing to see it. The cultural changes spread throughout the company. The wage audit results had been distributed, and nearly 40% of employees received compensation adjustments. Some were small cost of living increases. Others were significant corrections for workers who'd been systematically underpaid for years. The janitorial staff, Frank's former colleagues, saw their hourly wages increase by an average of 38%. "You didn't have to do this," said Jerome, a man Frank had worked alongside for 2 years. "We weren't expecting." "You should have expected it all along," Frank interrupted. "You keep this place running. You deserve to be paid like it." Jerome shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Colonel, for everything." "Just Frank. I'm not in the military anymore. Respect like yours doesn't come with a title." Jerome smiled. "You're Colonel to me. Always will be." 3 weeks into the training program, the Pentagon called. General Walsh, head of the Acquisition Committee, wanted to move up the evaluation. Victoria took the call in her office with Frank beside her. "How far up?" she asked, her stomach nodding. 2 weeks from Monday. We've had 2 other contractors fall through and we need to accelerate our timeline. If Meridian performs well, we could have a signed contract by end of January. Victoria covered the phone and looked at Frank. 2 weeks. He nodded slowly. "We can do it. The pilots are ready. The technical issues are resolved. We just need to stay focused." She uncovered the phone. "We'll be ready, General." "I hope so, Ms. Ashford. Because I'll be honest with you, there are people in this building who think you're a circus instead of a serious contractor. That video hasn't done you any favors." "With respect, General, that video showed exactly who we were. A company that was failing because we were too arrogant to listen. But it also showed what happens when we finally open our eyes. Colonel Jackson flew that helicopter better than anyone we've ever seen, and he did it because we finally gave him the chance." There was a pause on the line. "I look forward to seeing if the reality matches the rhetoric," Walsh said finally. "Monday, 2 weeks. Don't disappoint me." The line went dead. Victoria set down the phone. "He's expecting us to fail. Then we'll change his mind." Frank stood up. "I need to adjust the training schedule, and we need to decide who flies the demonstration." "I assumed you would." "I'm 74 years old, Victoria. The Pentagon wants to know this helicopter can be flown by regular military pilots, not just old test pilot specialists. I should coach, not fly." "Then who?" Frank considered the question. "Lieutenant Kim is the strongest technical pilot. Rodriguez has the most combat experience. Either of them could handle it." But this isn't just about competence. It's about telling a story. The Pentagon is sending evaluators who've heard about what happened here. They're going to be watching for signs that we're a circus instead of a serious contractor. Victoria felt a chill. "You think the video hurt us?" "I think it made us interesting, which is both good and bad. Good because they're paying attention. Bad because they're looking for reasons to disqualify us. What do? We tell them the truth, all of it. We don't hide from what happened. We show them that the changes we've made aren't distractions, they're the reason we're suddenly succeeding." The next 2 weeks were the most intense of Victoria's professional life. Every system was tested and retested. Every pilot logged additional training hours. The hangar was cleaned and organized to military standards. Documentation was compiled, reviewed, and refined. Frank pushed himself harder than anyone, despite Victoria's protests. She found him in his office at midnight, more often than not, reviewing data, adjusting protocols, preparing briefings for the evaluation team. "You need to sleep," she told him 4 days before the evaluation. "I'll sleep when this is over." "Frank, you're going to collapse." "I've survived worse." He looked up from his tablet, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but also something else. Purpose. Determination. The fire of someone who finally had something worth fighting for. "My daughter's coming this weekend," he said. "Sarah and Emma. They're flying in Friday night." "That's wonderful." Terrifying is more like it. Frank managed a weak smile. 7 years old. Never met her. What do I even say to a 7-year-old? You tell her the truth, that her grandpa made mistakes and lost his way for a while, but he's found it again. Kids understand that better than adults. I hope you're right. Friday evening arrived. Victoria watched from her office window as Frank walked across the parking lot to meet his daughter's car. She saw him stop. Saw a woman get out, Sarah presumably followed by a small girl with braided hair and a bright pink backpack. Frank dropped to one knee to be at eye level with the child. Victoria couldn't hear what was said. But she saw the moment Emma's shyness broke, saw her throw her small arms around Frank's neck. Saw Frank's shoulders shake with what could only be sobs. Saw Sarah wrap her arms around both of them, the 3 generations holding each other in the fading light. Victoria felt tears running down her own face. This was what they'd been fighting for. Not contracts and profits. Connection, dignity, family restored. The Pentagon evaluation team arrived Monday afternoon. 6 people emerged from government SUVs, 3 in military flight suits, 2 in business attire, and 1 older man in a suit that practically screamed senior Pentagon official. General Raymond Walsh was in his early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of assessing gaze that missed nothing. He shook hands with Victoria and Frank, his grip firm, his expression unreadable. I've heard quite a bit about you both, he said. Some from official reports, some from a very interesting video that's been circulating. Victoria's heart sank, but Frank spoke calmly. General, we're prepared to address any concerns about that incident as part of our formal briefing. I should hope so. That's part of why we moved up the evaluation. Needed to see firsthand if Meridian is a stable operation or a publicity stunt. The technical briefing lasted 2 hours. Marcus led the engineering presentation with quiet competence, walking the evaluation team through every aspect of the Wraith's design. The Pentagon engineers gradually shifted from skepticism to genuine interest as the data accumulated. But it was Frank's portion that really captured their attention. He explained the flight control philosophy, the deliberate oscillation design, the training protocols they'd developed. His presentation was clear, concise, and utterly authoritative. General Walsh interrupted several times with sharp questions, and Frank answered each one without hesitation. The other military pilots in the room began nodding along, recognizing the combat flight theory behind the design. Then Walsh asked the question Victoria had been dreading. Ms. Ashford, I need to understand what happened that day. Not the sanitized version, the truth. Because right now it looks like your company was in chaos until a janitor saved you. That's not the kind of stability the Pentagon needs in a long-term contractor. Victoria took a deep breath. Complete honesty. No spin. That's what Frank had taught her. General, you're absolutely right. We were in chaos. For 3 years we'd been failing to solve problems that should have been straightforward, because our organizational culture valued credentials and hierarchy over actual competence. I personally created that culture through my leadership or lack of it. She pulled up a slide showing the company's testing failures over time. We had the expertise we needed already in our building. Colonel Jackson applied for an engineering position when we opened this facility, and our HR department rejected him without an interview because he was 71 years old. So he took a janitorial position because he needed the work. And for 3 years, he watched us fail while possessing the exact knowledge we needed to succeed. Walsh leaned forward. Why didn't he speak up? He did, sir, Frank interjected. I wrote a detailed technical analysis 6 months ago and left it on our lead engineer's desk. It was dismissed without being read because it came from a janitor. Marcus spoke up, his voice steady, despite obvious discomfort. That was my decision, General, and it was wrong. I let pride and assumption blind me to a valid technical solution. Victoria continued. The incident you saw on video was the breaking point. I publicly humiliated Colonel Jackson by challenging him to fly the Wraith thinking I was making a point about expertise. Instead, He made a point about my failures as a leader. She advanced to the next slide showing the organizational changes implemented since that day. We responded by completely restructuring our culture, immediate wage corrections for underpaid employees, open-door policies for ideas from any level, promotion based on competence rather than credentials alone. And yes, we gave Colonel Jackson the director position he should have had 3 years ago. That's quite a transformation in less than a month, Walsh said skeptically. It is, and it's been expensive, disruptive, and controversial. Victoria met his eyes. But it's also why we're suddenly succeeding. Our testing efficiency has increased by 40%. Our engineering team is solving problems in days instead of months. Our pilots are flying the Wraith to capabilities we didn't know it had. None of that happened by accident. She pulled up the final slide performance metrics over the past month compared to the previous 3 years. General, you asked if we're stable. The answer is no, not if stable means keeping everything the same. But if stable means having systems in place to continuously improve, to recognize and fix our failures, to value every person's contribution, regardless of their title, then yes, we're becoming stable in the way that actually matters. Walsh studied the data for a long moment. And what happens when the novelty wears off? When the feel-good story stops being enough to motivate people? Frank stood up. General, I've led combat units in 3 different war zones. I've trained hundreds of pilots, and I can tell you that the best teams aren't built on novelty or feel-good stories. They're built on trust, competence, and genuine respect. He gestured to the window overlooking the hangar floor, where the crew was preparing the Wraith for flight demonstrations. Every person in this facility now believes their contribution matters. The technician who caught a turbine vibration this weekend did it because he knew he'd be listened to, not dismissed. The junior engineer who suggested a software fix did it because she wasn't afraid of being mocked. His voice carried absolute conviction. You're right to be skeptical about sudden changes. But this isn't sudden. It's 3 years of problems finally being addressed by people who care enough to fix them. Walsh was quiet, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he stood. All right, I appreciate the honesty. Now let's see if the results match the rhetoric. I want to see this helicopter fly, and I want to see it flown by military pilots, not just your experts. The flight demonstrations began at 1400 hours. The Pentagon pilots flew the Wraith through every scenario imaginable. High-speed maneuvers, rapid altitude changes, simulated combat situations, emergency procedures. Each pilot spent 40 minutes in the cockpit. Each one came out looking impressed and slightly exhilarated. Victoria watched from the observation room with her heart in her throat. Sarah stood beside her with Emma, who pressed her face against the glass with wide eyes. "Grandpa made that fly," Emma whispered in awe as the Wraith executed a particularly aggressive banking turn. "He helped make it fly right," Sarah told her daughter. "And he taught those pilots how to do it properly." "Grandpa's smart." "Yes, sweetheart. He really is." The final test ended at 17:30. The Pentagon team retreated to a conference room for 90 minutes of deliberation, while Victoria, Frank, and the Meridian leadership team waited in agonizing uncertainty. Frank sat quietly, his hands trembling slightly. Whether from nerves or fatigue, Victoria couldn't tell. At 1900 hours, Colonel Brennan emerged from the conference room. "They want to see everyone. Main conference room. Now." This was it. Victoria stood on shaking legs. Frank rose more slowly, taking a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Together they walked into the conference room where General Walsh and his team waited. Walsh stood at the head of the table, his expression grave. "Mrs. Ashford, Colonel Jackson, please sit." They sat. The silence stretched unbearably. "I'll be direct," Walsh began. "When we arrived this morning, I was prepared to disqualify Meridian from consideration. The video, the reports of organizational chaos, the concerns about stability, all of it suggested a company that wasn't ready for a major Pentagon contract." Victoria felt her heart sinking. "But after today's evaluation, I have to say I was wrong." Walsh's stern expression cracked into something approaching a smile. The Wraith is an exceptional aircraft. More importantly, the team behind it is exceptional. The technical competence, the flight performance, the systematic approach to problem-solving, everything we saw today demonstrated a contractor we can trust. Victoria couldn't breathe. Pending final budget approval and contract negotiations, I'm recommending Meridian Aerospace as the primary contractor for the AH-7 Wraith program. Initial order of 47 aircraft with options for up to 200 more over 5 years. The room erupted. Marcus let out a whoop. James actually smiled. Frank sat very still, his eyes closed, his weathered hands pressed flat on the table. Victoria found her voice. General, we thank you. Thank you for giving us this chance. Thank your team. Walsh extended his hand. They earned it. As handshakes and congratulations were exchanged, Victoria looked at Frank. Tears were running down his face, but he was smiling. We did it, she whispered. You did it, he corrected. You had the courage to change everything when it mattered most. We did it together. Outside the conference room, Sarah and Emma waited. Emma broke free from her mother and ran to Frank, who scooped her up with a laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, a place that had been silent for years. Did you win, Grandpa? Frank held his granddaughter close. His voice was thick with tears. Yes, sweetheart. We won. The celebration that night was modest but genuine. Someone brought pizza. Someone else found champagne, the cheap kind from the grocery store down the street, but nobody cared. Engineers mingled with technicians. Pilots swapped stories with maintenance workers. The janitorial staff, Frank's former colleagues, were invited for the first time anyone could remember. Victoria stood near the Wraith watching her team celebrate and realized she didn't recognize them anymore. Not because they'd changed, but because she was finally seeing them clearly. You look like you're somewhere else. She turned to find Frank beside her, Emma perched on his hip. The little girl had a slice of pizza in one hand and was studying Victoria with curious eyes. Just thinking, Victoria said, about how different everything feels. Good different or bad different? I'm not sure yet. Ask me in 6 months. Frank smiled. It was an expression Victoria had rarely seen on his face, genuine, unguarded happiness. Fair enough. Emma tugged on his collar. Grandpa, is this lady your boss? She is. She looks tired. Victoria laughed despite herself. I am tired. Your grandpa works me very hard. Grandpa works hard too. Mommy says he doesn't sleep enough. Emma turned her serious gaze to Frank. You should sleep more, Grandpa. Mommy says sleep is important for old people. Frank's eyebrows rose. Old people. You have gray hair. That means you're old. But Mommy says old is okay because old people are smart. Well, Frank said, glancing at Victoria. I can't argue with that logic. Sarah appeared beside them, reaching for Emma. I think someone needs to go to bed. I'm not tired, Emma protested, even as her eyes drooped. Of course you're not. Sarah lifted her daughter from Frank's arms. Say goodnight to Grandpa and Ms. Ashford. Good night, Grandpa. Good night, tired lady. Victoria bit back a laugh. Good night, Emma. Frank kissed his granddaughter's forehead. Sleep well, sweetheart. I'll see you tomorrow. Sarah lingered after Emma had wrapped her arms around her neck and started to drift off. Dad, I want you to know, seeing you today, watching you with those pilots, hearing what General Walsh said about you. Her voice cracked. I'm so proud of you. Mom would have been proud of you. Frank's composure wavered. Sarah, I know we lost time. I know there's a lot we need to talk about, but right now I just want you to know that my daughter thinks her grandpa is a superhero, and she's right. She kissed his cheek and walked away before he could respond. Frank stood very still for a moment. Victoria pretended not to notice him wiping his eyes. She's beautiful, Victoria said quietly. Emma. She looks like her grandmother. Frank's voice was thick. Same eyes, same stubborn chin. Eleanor would have loved her so much. She knows her grandmother through you, through the stories you'll tell her, through who you are. Frank nodded slowly. I wasted 8 years, Victoria. 8 years I could have spent watching her grow up. Birthdays, Christmases, first days of school. All because I was too proud to let my children see me struggle. You can't get those years back, but you have all the years ahead. That's what Sarah said. Frank took a breath. She wants me to move to Colorado after all this is done. Be closer to her and Emma. Be part of their lives again. Victoria felt a sudden chill. Are you considering it? I don't know. Part of me wants to say yes immediately. But part of me... He gestured at the hangar at the celebrating team at the Wraith, sitting silent and powerful behind them. This matters too. What we're building here. The people who are counting on this to keep working. Frank, if you need to be with your family, I need both. His voice was firm. I've spent 12 years being invisible. 3 years of that was here mopping floors watching people fail. But before that, before the debt and the shame and the hiding, I had a life that mattered. A career that meant something. A family that loved me. He looked at her directly. You gave me back the career. Now I need to figure out how to have the family too. Not one or the other. Both. Victoria nodded. Then we'll figure it out. Whatever you need, flexible schedule, remote work options, whatever, we'll make it happen. You don't have to. I want to. Victoria cut him off. Frank, you saved this company. You saved me from becoming someone I would have hated. If there's anything I can do to help you rebuild your family while staying here, I will. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Partners. Victoria shook it. Partners. The weeks following the Pentagon evaluation were a whirlwind of contracts, negotiations, and impossible deadlines that somehow got met. The formal agreement was signed in late January, exactly as General Walsh had predicted. 47 aircraft in the initial order, with options for 200 more over 5 years. The total contract value exceeded $2 billion, enough to secure Meridian's future for a decade. But Victoria quickly learned that winning the contract was only the beginning. We need to triple our manufacturing capacity, Marcus said during an emergency planning meeting. Our current facility can produce maybe 8 units per year. The Pentagon wants 12 in the first 18 months. Then we expand, Victoria replied. What do we need? New equipment, more space. About 200 additional employees, engineers, technicians, assemblers, quality control specialists. And janitorial staff, Frank added quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. If we're tripling our workforce, we're tripling our facility. That means more people to keep it running, more floors to clean, more trash to empty, more invisible workers doing invisible work. He looked around the table. When we hire them at fair wages, with full benefits, with the same respect we give everyone else. That's non-negotiable. James Whitmore, who had become one of Frank's most vocal supporters, nodded. Agreed. Victoria, we should establish that as company policy before the expansion begins. Written into the employee handbook. No exceptions. Draft it, Victoria said. I want it on my desk by Friday. The expansion brought challenges Victoria hadn't anticipated. New employees meant new training. New training meant new opportunities for the old culture to reassert itself. Victoria caught 3 incidents in the first month: senior engineers dismissing ideas from junior staff, a supervisor mocking a technician's suggestion, a manager telling a new hire that things work differently here than in the real world. Each time she addressed it directly. Tell me what happened, she said to the supervisor. A man named Patterson, who'd been with the company for 8 years. It was nothing, just a joke. Jokes that make people feel stupid aren't jokes. They're weapons. Victoria leaned forward. What exactly did you say? Patterson shifted uncomfortably. Jenkins suggested we modify the assembly sequence to reduce errors. I told him that if assembly workers knew how to design processes, they'd be engineers instead of assembly workers. And how did Jenkins respond? He didn't. He went back to work. He went back to work feeling like his input doesn't matter. Feeling like he should keep his mouth shut and just do what he's told. Victoria's voice hardened. Patterson, do you know how much money we wasted before Frank Jackson came along? How many months we lost because engineers couldn't imagine that someone outside their department might have a useful idea? That was different. It wasn't different. It was exactly the same. The same arrogance. The same assumption that credentials trump competence. The same culture that nearly destroyed this company. She stood up. You have a choice. You can adapt to how we operate now, which means actually listening to people, regardless of their job title, or you can find somewhere else to work. I won't force you to stay somewhere you're uncomfortable. But I won't let you poison what we're building either. Patterson stared at her for a long moment. Then, he nodded slowly. I'll apologize to Jenkins. You'll do more than apologize. You'll implement his suggestion if it has merit. And you'll give him credit publicly if it works. 3 weeks later, Jenkins's modified assembly sequence reduced error rates by 22%. Patterson, to his credit, acknowledged it in front of the entire team. The transformation wasn't always smooth, but it was real. Frank's training program became legendary in military aviation circles. Pilots who'd trained under him went on to instruct others, spreading his methods throughout the helicopter community. The Pentagon sent observers to study his techniques, and 2 other defense contractors reached out, asking if he'd consult on their programs. You should do it, Victoria told him. The consulting. It would be good for the industry. I don't want to spread myself too thin. We have enough work here. Frank, you've built something that matters. Something that could help other companies avoid the mistakes we made. Don't you want that to spread? He considered it. Maybe, but not yet. We're still fragile here. The culture could slip back if we're not careful. Then train someone to maintain it when you're not around. Frank raised an eyebrow. Who did you have in mind? Victoria smiled. Marcus. He's changed more than anyone. He understands what we did wrong because he was part of the problem, and he's committed to being part of the solution. Frank nodded slowly. That's not a bad idea. The best teachers are often the ones who learned the hardest lessons. He found Marcus in the engineering bay that afternoon, reviewing specifications for the next production run. I need to talk to you about something, Frank said. Marcus looked up immediately wary. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I want to discuss your future. They walked to Frank's office where Frank closed the door and sat down across from Marcus. Victoria thinks you should be my successor. Marcus blinked. Your what? Not immediately, but eventually. She thinks you understand the culture we're building well enough to maintain it when I'm not here. I threw away your note. Marcus's voice was raw. I dismissed you without a second thought. I'm the reason we lost 6 months and $40 million. Why would you trust me with anything? Because you understand why that was wrong. Frank leaned forward. Marcus, the people who never make mistakes aren't the best leaders. The best leaders are the ones who make mistakes, recognize them, and change. That's you. I'm not a leader. I'm an engineer. You're both. You just haven't accepted it yet. Frank paused. I'm 74 years old. I'm not going to be here forever. Sarah wants me to spend more time in Colorado with her and Emma. And honestly, I want that too. I missed 8 years of my granddaughter's life. I don't want to miss any more. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. What would you need from me? I need you to learn. Not just the technical side, you already know that. I need you to learn how to listen. How to make people feel heard. How to create an environment where the best idea wins, regardless of where it comes from. That's harder than engineering. Much harder. Engineering has rules. People are chaos. Frank smiled slightly. But it's also more important. The Wraith is a good helicopter. But a good culture is what makes the difference between a company that builds one good product and a company that keeps innovating for decades. Marcus took a breath. Okay, I'll try. But I need you to be patient with me. I have a lot of old habits to unlearn. We all do. Frank extended his hand. That's what this is about. Becoming better than we were yesterday. They shook on it. Spring arrived with new challenges and new opportunities. The first production Wraith rolled off the line in April ahead of schedule, under budget and exceeding every specification. The Pentagon was so impressed that they exercised their option for 20 additional aircraft immediately. But the success brought scrutiny. A business journalist named Claire Morrison requested an interview with Victoria specifically about what she called the Meridian transformation. Victoria agreed against James's advice. This could backfire, James warned, if she digs too deep. Then she finds what? That we treated people badly and decided to change. That's not a scandal, James. That's the story we've been telling since day one. The interview lasted 3 hours. Morrison asked about the video, how Victoria felt watching it go viral, whether she'd considered legal action against whoever leaked it, what she'd said to Frank afterward. I felt ashamed, Victoria said honestly. Watching myself mock a decorated military veteran for entertainment, there's no spinning that. I was cruel, and I got caught being cruel, and I deserved everything that came afterward. Some people would say you're only changing because you got caught. They might be right. I don't know if I would have changed on my own. But does it matter? The change is real. The results are real. The people whose lives have improved because we finally started treating them fairly, they don't care whether my motivation was pure. They care that their paychecks are bigger and their voices are heard. Morrison scribbled notes. What about Colonel Jackson? There are rumors he's planning to leave. Victoria felt a flash of anxiety, but kept her expression neutral. Frank has family in Colorado that he wants to be closer to. We're working out arrangements that let him be part of both his family and this company. It's not either or. And if he does leave eventually, what happens to the culture you've built? It continues. Because it's not about Frank. It's not about me. It's about the hundreds of people who now believe their contributions matter, who speak up in meetings, who bring ideas forward without fear, who treat each other with respect, because that's how we operate now. Victoria leaned forward. Culture isn't something one person creates. It's something everyone maintains. Frank taught us how to see differently. Now it's up to all of us to keep seeing. The article was published in Fortune 2 weeks later, under the headline, Meridian Aerospace, Can Compassionate Capitalism Actually Work? It was overwhelmingly positive. Morrison had interviewed not just Victoria and Frank, but dozens of employees at every level. Janitors who talked about finally being able to afford health care for their families. Engineers who described feeling liberated to take risks. Pilots who said Frank's training had made them better aviators than they'd ever imagined. But the quote that went viral came from Marcus Chen. I used to think leadership was about being the smartest person in the room, he'd told Morrison. Now I understand it's about making everyone in the room smarter. Frank Jackson taught me that not through lectures, but by example. He listens before he speaks. He asks questions before he gives answers. He treats the person mopping the floors with the same respect he gives the CEO. And somehow that makes all of us want to be better. The article brought attention Victoria hadn't expected. 3 Fortune 500 companies reached out asking how to implement similar changes. A dozen smaller firms requested consultations. 2 business schools asked Victoria to speak about ethical leadership in defense contracting. She said no to most of the requests. There was too much work to do. At Meridian, too much still fragile about what they'd built. But one request she couldn't refuse. The Military Aviation Association wants to honor Colonel Jackson, her assistant told her. Lifetime Achievement Award. Ceremony is in October in Washington. Victoria found Frank in the hangar, as she often did, reviewing data on a tablet, while the production team worked around him. "They want to give you an award?" she said. Frank didn't look up. "Who does?" "The MAA, Lifetime Achievement. Big ceremony in D.C., black tie, generals, senators, the whole thing." Frank set down his tablet. "I'm not sure I want that." "Why not?" "Because I didn't do anything special. I just flew a helicopter." Victoria stared at him. "Frank, you revolutionized how we think about stabilization systems. You created a training program that's being adopted across the military. I did my job." Frank's voice was quiet but firm. "The same job I did for 30 years in the Army. The same job I would have done here if anyone had bothered to ask. But they didn't ask. And you did it anyway. That's what makes it special." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "My wife never got an award," he said finally. 40 years of nursing. Thousands of patients she helped. Families she comforted. Lives she saved. Nobody gave her a ceremony or a trophy. Nobody wrote articles about her." His voice cracked slightly. "She was the best person I ever knew. And when she died, the world didn't notice, just moved on like she'd never existed." Victoria felt her chest tighten. "Frank, I don't want awards. I don't want recognition. I want to do work that matters and go home to my family and know that I made a difference without needing anyone to tell me so." He looked at her directly. "That's what Ellie taught me. Success isn't about what you get, it's about what you give." Victoria sat down beside him. "What if the award isn't for you?" she asked quietly. "What if it's for all the other Frank Jacksons out there? The ones pushing mops and being invisible and wondering if their experience still matters?" Frank's expression shifted slightly. "What if seeing you on that stage being honored for everything you've accomplished gives someone the courage to speak up, to refuse to be invisible, to believe their expertise is worth something, even if the world has written them off?" She paused. "You can reject the recognition for yourself. But maybe you don't have the right to reject what it could mean for others." Frank was quiet for a very long time. "Ellie used to say something like that," he finally admitted. "She used to tell me that courage isn't about being brave for yourself. It's about being brave for the people who are watching you." She sounds like she was very wise. She was. Frank's eyes were bright. She really was. He picked up his tablet again, then set it down. "If I accept this award, I want to donate the honorarium to a scholarship fund for non-traditional students, people who are starting over later in life, people who got knocked down and are trying to get back up. I think that's a wonderful idea. And I want to name it after Ellie. The Eleanor Jackson Scholarship." Victoria felt tears threatening. "That's perfect." Frank nodded slowly, as if coming to terms with a decision he'd been resisting. "Okay, tell them I'll accept, but I'm going to say exactly what I think in my speech. No corporate talking points. No sanitized version of what happened. The truth. I wouldn't expect anything less." Frank almost smiled. "And I'm bringing Emma. She should see her grandpa at least once doing something other than pushing a mop or staring at a tablet. I think she'd love that." "I think so too." Frank's expression softened. "Did I ever tell you what she said last weekend? She asked me why I have so many wrinkles. I told her it was because I'd lived a long time. And she said..." His voice caught. "She said that meant I must have a lot of stories. And she wanted to hear all of them." Victoria didn't try to hide her tears. "Then you'd better start telling them." "I am." Frank looked around the hangar at the helicopters being built, at the team working together, at everything they'd created. "Every day I spend here, every lesson I teach, every time I help someone see that they're worth more than their job title." He met her eyes. "That's the story, Victoria. Not the award, not the contract, not even the helicopter. The story is that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be, And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see you clearly. Victoria nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the team work, listening to the sounds of creation and collaboration and change. And for the first time in her life, Victoria understood what success actually looked like. October arrived with a crispness in the air that reminded Frank of his early army days, when autumn meant training exercises and the smell of jet fuel at dawn. 2 years had passed since that Friday afternoon when Victoria Ashford had pointed at him across a hangar floor and dared him to fly. 2 years since he'd set down his mop and walked toward a cockpit that everyone assumed he had no business entering. 2 years since everything changed. The ceremony was scheduled for Saturday evening at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Frank had resisted the grandeur of it until the last possible moment, but the Military Aviation Association had been insistent. Lifetime Achievement Awards were not handed out in conference rooms. "You're fidgeting," Sarah said, adjusting his bow tie for the third time. "I hate these things." "You commanded combat units in 3 war zones. You can survive a dinner party." Frank caught her hand gently. "It's not the party I'm worried about. It's the speech." Sarah's expression softened. "You've been preparing for weeks. You know exactly what you want to say." Knowing and doing are different animals. Frank looked past her to where Emma was spinning in circles, her blue dress flaring out around her. "When I was flying helicopters, I never had to think about what I was doing. My hands just knew. This, talking about feelings, about what things mean, that's not me." "Dad." Sarah put both hands on his shoulders and made him look at her. "The reason this award matters is because of who you are, not because of some perfect speech. Just tell the truth. That's what you've always done. The truth got me in a lot of trouble over the years. It also saved a company and changed how people think about who deserves respect." Sarah kissed his cheek. "Mom would be so proud of you tonight. You know that, right?" Frank's eyes burned. "I hope so. I know so." Sarah stepped back. "Now stop fidgeting. The car will be here in 10 minutes and Emma wants to show you her shoes." Emma bounded over her small feet, barely touching the ground. "Grandpa, look. They're sparkly." Frank crouched down to examine the glittery silver shoes with appropriate seriousness. "Those are the finest shoes I've ever seen. Are they regulation? What's regulation?" "It means are they allowed?" Emma giggled. "Mommy bought them special for tonight. She said I get to meet generals." "You do? Are you nervous?" "No." Emma's confidence was absolute. "Mommy says generals are just people with fancy uniforms. And I'm wearing sparkly shoes, so we're even." Frank laughed a real laugh, the kind that started in his belly and worked its way up. "I can't argue with that logic." The museum was overwhelming. Frank had been to the Smithsonian before decades ago, but he'd forgotten how vast it was. How many aircraft hung from the ceiling like frozen birds? How much history pressed in from every direction? They'd closed the main hall for the event, setting up tables beneath the Spirit of St. Louis and the Wright Flyer. Nearly 300 people filled the space generals, admirals, defense industry executives, senators, and at least 2 former secretaries of defense. "Grandpa," Emma whispered, clutching his hand, "there are a lot of people here." "There are. Are they all here for you?" Frank looked down at his granddaughter's upturned face. Her eyes were wide, taking in everything with the wonder that only children possessed. "They're here because they care about aviation," he said. "About the people who build aircraft and fly them and keep them running. I'm just one small part of that." "Mommy says you're a hero." "Your mommy is biased." "What's biased?" "It means she loves me, so she sees me better than I am." Emma shook her head firmly. "No. Mommy says you're a hero because you didn't give up. Even when things were hard. Even when people were mean." Frank felt his throat tighten. "Out of the mouths of babes," Ellie used to say. Children see what adults are too complicated to notice. Victoria appeared at his elbow, elegant in a black gown that probably cost more than Frank had earned in his first year as a janitor. But her expression was warm, genuine, nothing like the cold executive who had mocked him across a hangar floor 2 years ago. "They're ready for you," she said. "The committee chair wants to do introductions in about 15 minutes. "I'm not sure I'm ready for them." "You are." Victoria squeezed his arm. "Frank, I've watched you teach pilots how to fly impossible maneuvers. I've seen you face down generals and board members and engineers who were certain they knew better than you. This is just another flight. Trust your instruments." He almost smiled. "You've been paying attention." "I had a good teacher." Sarah took Emma to find their table while Victoria walked Frank toward the stage. Along the way, people stopped him, former students, military officers he'd served with, engineers who'd worked on projects he'd helped develop decades ago. "Colonel Jackson," said a man Frank didn't immediately recognize. "You probably don't remember me. Lieutenant Davis. You taught me emergency procedures at Fort Rucker in '94. Frank studied the man's face now, lined with age and experience. "Davis, you were the one who couldn't stop over-controlling the collective." Davis laughed. "That's me. You made me practice hover work for 3 straight weeks until I got it right. I thought you were the meanest instructor alive. And now I've been flying Apaches for 28 years. Never lost a bird. Never lost a crew member." Davis's voice grew serious. "What you taught me saved my life more times than I can count. I wanted to say thank you. Properly. In person." Frank shook his hand firmly. "You did the hard part, Lieutenant. I just showed you where to look." "No, sir. You showed me how to see." Davis stepped back. "Congratulations on the award. There's nobody who deserves it more." The introductions took 45 minutes. Frank sat at the head table trying to focus on the speeches while his mind kept drifting to what he would say. He'd written and rewritten his remarks a dozen times. Each version felt wrong, too formal, too humble, too angry, too soft. In the end, he'd thrown away the written speech entirely. He would say what he felt. That had always served him better than careful planning. "And now," the committee chair announced, "it is my profound honor to present the Military Aviation Association's Lifetime Achievement Award to Colonel Frank Jackson, United States Army, retired." The applause started before Frank could stand. He walked to the podium, slowly feeling every one of his 76 years in his joints. The room was a sea of faces, some familiar, most not. He found Emma in the crowd, her sparkly shoes visible even from the stage. She waved enthusiastically. Frank adjusted the microphone. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, "so I'll just tell you the truth and hope that's enough." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 2 years ago, I was a janitor. I pushed a mop around a hangar floor in Virginia, cleaning up after engineers and executives who never once looked me in the eye. I made $18 an hour. I lived in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor and a hot plate that barely worked. I hadn't spoken to my children in 8 years because I was too ashamed to let them see what I'd become. The room was absolutely silent. Before that, I was a colonel in the United States Army. I flew combat missions in 3 different conflicts. I helped develop flight systems for aircraft that some of you in this room are still flying. I trained hundreds of pilots who went on to train hundreds more. I had a career that mattered, a family that loved me, a life that made sense. Frank's voice steadied. And then my wife got sick. Cancer. The kind that takes years to kill you and takes everything you have trying to stop it. By the time she died, I was broken, bankrupt, empty, and I made the worst decision of my life. I disappeared, cut off my children, told myself I was protecting them from seeing their father as a failure, but really, I was just protecting my pride. He looked at Sarah in the audience. Her eyes were bright with tears. For 12 years I was invisible. First by circumstance, no one hires a 70-year-old pilot when there are 30-year-olds lining up for the same job. Then by choice, I stopped believing I had anything worth offering. I became exactly what the world assumed I was. An old man with a mop. Nobody. Nothing. He gripped the podium. Then something happened. A CEO at the company where I worked, she was having a bad day. Her project was failing. Her team was making excuses. And she needed someone to blame someone to make herself feel better by comparison. So she pointed at me, the janitor, and she dared me to fly the helicopter her engineers couldn't fix. A murmur rippled through the room. Everyone had seen the video. She thought it was a joke. So did everyone else in that hangar. An old black man in coveralls thinking he could fly a cutting-edge military prototype. The laughter was loud. The phones came out. They were ready to watch me humiliate myself. Frank smiled slightly. But here's the thing about being invisible for a long time. You learn to watch, to listen, to see what others miss, because they're too busy being important. I'd spent 3 years mopping floors around that helicopter, listening to engineers argue about problems I could have solved in 10 minutes. I knew that aircraft better than anyone in the building, not because I'm smarter, but because I was paying attention when no one thought I was worth noticing. He straightened. So I flew it. 10 minutes and 47 seconds. No incidents. And when I landed, I picked up my mop and asked if they wanted to pay me in cash or check. Laughter. Real laughter, warm and surprised, rolled through the audience. That video went viral. Millions of people watched a janitor school, a room full of experts. But what they didn't see was what happened next. What happened when Victoria Ashford, that CEO, looked at herself in the mirror and didn't like what she found. Frank paused. She could have buried the video, fired me quietly, spun the story to protect her reputation. Instead, she apologized, publicly. She offered me a job, not charity, but a real position based on my actual qualifications. And then she did something even harder. She changed her entire company, raised wages for workers who'd been underpaid for years, created policies that valued ideas regardless of who suggested them, admitted in front of her board, her employees, the whole world, that she'd been wrong. He looked at Victoria. That took more courage than anything I've ever done in a cockpit. It's easy to be brave when you're the underdog. It's much harder to be brave when you're the one who has to admit you've been the problem. Victoria wiped her eyes, but she was smiling. This award has my name on it, but it belongs to everyone who refuses to let the world define their worth. The nurses working double shifts who should have been doctors but couldn't afford medical school. The veterans driving trucks because no one would hire them for the jobs they were trained to do. The single mothers working 2 jobs who could run companies if anyone gave them a chance. The old people sitting in nursing homes with decades of wisdom that nobody asks for anymore. Frank's voice grew stronger. We live in a world that decides what people are worth based on titles and credentials, and how they look and how old they are. We walk past expertise every single day because it's wearing coveralls instead of a suit. We throw away ideas because they come from the wrong person. We waste human potential on a scale that should embarrass us all. He leaned into the microphone. I'm standing here tonight because one person decided to see me differently. To look past the mop and the coveralls and the gray hair and actually see who I was. That's all it took. One person willing to change their mind. Frank found Emma in the crowd again. She was watching him with absolute attention, her sparkly shoes forgotten. My granddaughter is here tonight. She's 7 years old. I missed the first 7 years of her life because I was hiding from my own shame. But now I get to watch her grow up. I get to tell her stories about her grandmother who was the bravest person I ever knew. I get to teach her that what you do matters more than what you are. That dignity isn't something others give you, it's something you claim for yourself. His voice cracked slightly. My wife, Eleanor Ellie, she used to say that everyone has a story worth telling. Every single person you pass on the street, every worker you ignore, every old man pushing a mop in a forgotten corner of a building. They all have stories, victories and defeats, love and loss, wisdom earned through years of living. And most of those stories never get heard because we're too busy to listen. Frank straightened to his full height. I'm donating the honorarium from this award to establish the Eleanor Jackson Scholarship Fund. It will help non-traditional students, people starting over later in life, people who got knocked down and are trying to get back up, pursue education in aviation engineering, and any field where experience and determination matter more than age or pedigree. He paused. Because Ellie believed that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. And she was right. At 74 years old, I walked away from a mop and back into a cockpit. I reconnected with children I'd abandoned and met a granddaughter I didn't know existed. I found work that matters and colleagues who respect me and a purpose that gets me out of bed every morning. Frank's eyes swept across the room. If you take anything from tonight, take this. Look at the people around you. Really look. The administrative assistant who's been with your company for 20 years. The security guard who served 3 tours in Iraq. The janitor who raised 4 kids on minimum wage while working nights. They have stories. They have wisdom. They have value that you've been trained to overlook. He let the silence stretch. See them, listen to them, and when they tell you they can do something impossible, maybe, just maybe, give them a chance to prove it. Frank stepped back from the podium. The applause was thunderous. It went on and on, people rising from their seats, the sound washing over him like a wave. He saw Victoria crying openly, saw Sarah clutching Emma, both of them beaming, saw faces he didn't know, nodding with something that looked like recognition, like they were seeing themselves in his story. He made his way back to his table on unsteady legs. Emma broke free from Sarah and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "That was the best speech ever," she declared. "You made Mommy cry." "I made myself cry too." "Grandpa." Emma looked up at him with serious eyes. "Is that true? That you were invisible?" "For a while, yes. But I can see you." Frank crouched down to her level, his old knees protesting. "You can now. Because someone gave me a chance to be seen again." Emma thought about this. If I see invisible people, will they become visible too? That's exactly how it works, sweetheart. That's exactly how it works. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes and congratulations and conversations that Frank would barely remember afterward. What he would remember was the weight of Emma's hand in his as they walked through the museum after the dinner ended, looking at aircraft that had changed history. "That's the one Grandpa helped design?" Emma asked, pointing at an Apache helicopter mounted in a display. "I helped design the flight control system. Just a small part. But still your part." "Yes, still my part." They stopped in front of the Wright Flyer, the aircraft that had started everything. "Grandpa, do you think those brothers knew they were changing the world?" Frank considered the question. "I think they just wanted to fly. The changing the world part came later." "Is that what you wanted, to fly? More than anything?" Emma squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you got to fly again, even if it took a long time." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." They flew back to Virginia the next morning. The company had changed even more in Frank's absence, the daily operations continuing smoothly under Marcus's supervision. The second production run of Wraiths was ahead of schedule. 3 allied nations had signed preliminary agreements for their own orders. The training program Frank had established was now being taught by instructors he had personally certified. Victoria met him in the hangar on Monday morning, looking tired but satisfied. "I heard the speech was incredible," she said. "You were there." "I was crying too hard to pay attention." She smiled. "But I've watched the recording 17 times since then. It's already been shared across every military aviation forum on the internet." "That's embarrassing." "It's inspiring." Victoria handed him a tablet. "Look at this." Frank scrolled through the emails, hundreds of them, from veterans who'd felt invisible after leaving the military, from older workers who'd been pushed out of careers they loved, from people who'd watched the video of his flight 2 years ago and hadn't stopped thinking about it since. One message caught his eye. It was from a 58-year-old woman named Maria Santos. "I was a flight instructor for 23 years, she'd written. When the economy crashed, I lost my job and couldn't find another one. Too old, they said. Not worth training. For 7 years, I've been working as a cashier, telling myself that my flying days were over. Last night, I watched your speech with my daughter. This morning, I applied for 3 aviation jobs. I don't know if I'll get any of them, but for the first time in years, I believe I deserve to try. Frank set down the tablet. We should hire her, he said. I was thinking the same thing. 3 weeks later, Maria Santos started work as an assistant flight instructor. Within 6 months, she was one of the best trainers on the team. The months turned into seasons. The seasons turned into years. Frank eventually reduced his hours, spending more time in Colorado with Sarah and Emma, while maintaining his role as director emeritus at Meridian. Marcus had stepped fully into the leadership role, carrying forward the culture that Frank had helped build. The Eleanor Jackson Scholarship Fund awarded its first grants on what would have been Ellie's 75th birthday. Frank attended the ceremony with Sarah and Emma, watching as 12 non-traditional students received funding to pursue their dreams. Your grandmother would have loved this, Frank told Emma, who was now 9 and already talking about becoming a pilot herself. Do you miss her, Grandpa? Every day. But I feel her with me too. In the work I do, in the people I help, in you. Emma leaned against him. Mommy says I have her eyes. You do, and her stubbornness, and her kindness. Is stubbornness good? When it's used for the right things, it's the best thing in the world. Victoria called him one evening in early autumn, 3 years after the Friday that had changed everything. I'm stepping down, she said without preamble. Frank set down his book. From the company. From CEO. Not completely. I'll stay on the board, keep a hand in strategic decisions. But it's time. The company doesn't need me running it anymore. It needs fresh eyes, new energy. Who's taking over? Marcus. The board approved it this morning. Victoria's voice carried something that sounded like peace. He's ready. He's been ready for a while. I was just too stubborn to see it. Sounds familiar? Victoria laughed. I learned from the best. Frank was quiet for a moment. Are you okay with this? Really? I am. It's strange I spent 20 years building that company, convincing myself that it couldn't survive without me. But watching it thrive under Marcus's leadership these past few years, it's better, Frank. Better than it was when I was holding on so tight. What will you do? That's the question, isn't it? Victoria paused. I've been thinking about consulting, helping other companies do what we did. Not just the technical changes, but the cultural ones. The hard conversations about who gets valued and who gets ignored. There's a lot of need for that. Too much, but it's a start. She took a breath. Frank, I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. What's that? Thank you for accepting my challenge that day, for not walking away when you had every right to, for showing all of us what we were missing. Frank felt his throat tighten. You gave me a chance when I'd stopped believing I deserved one. That's not nothing, Victoria. We gave each other chances. And look what happened. Her voice grew thick. You changed my life, Frank. Not just my company. My life. How I see the world. How I treat people. Who I want to be when I look in the mirror. You did the hard part. You chose to change. I just reminded you it was possible. That's everything, though. That's the whole thing. Someone believing in you when you've stopped believing in yourself. Victoria cleared her throat. I have to go. Board dinner tonight. But I wanted you to hear it from me first. About Marcus. About everything. Thank you for calling. Thank you for answering. All those years ago in that hangar when I dared you to fly, thank you for answering. Frank hung up the phone and sat for a long time in the gathering darkness. Ellie's photograph watched him from the shelf across the room. He'd taken to talking to her again after years of silence, telling her about Emma's latest accomplishments, about Sarah's new job, about the scholarship recipients and the pilots he'd trained, and the 1,000 small victories that added up to a life worth living. We did it, Ellie, he said softly. I found my way back. The photograph didn't answer, but Frank didn't need it to. He could feel her presence in the quiet room, in the peace that had finally settled into his bones, in the knowledge that the years he had left would be spent doing work that mattered with people who saw him clearly. Emma called him the next morning, as she did every Sunday. "Grandpa, guess what?" "What?" "I got an A on my essay about you." "About me." "My teacher said we had to write about someone who inspires us. I wrote about how you were invisible, but then you flew a helicopter, and now you help other people not be invisible anymore." Frank felt tears prick at his eyes. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." "My teacher cried when she read it. She said everyone has a story worth telling, just like you said in your speech, and she asked if you could come talk to our class sometime." "I'd like that very much." "Really? You'll come?" "Of course I will. I'll tell them what I tell everyone." "What's that?" Frank smiled, looking out the window at the morning light spreading across the mountains. "That it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. That every person you meet has value you might not see at first glance. That the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply to see them. Really see them, and believe in what they can become." He paused, remembering Ellie's words. Victoria's transformation. Emma's sparkly shoes, and every moment of the journey that had brought him from a mop and bucket to a place of purpose and peace. And that sometimes, Frank said, the greatest achievements come from the people the world has already written off. You just have to give them a chance to prove it. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, "I love you, Grandpa." "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." He hung up the phone and stood at the window watching the sun rise over a world that looked different than it had 3 years ago. Not because the world had changed, but because he had learned to see it clearly. Frank Jackson had been a janitor, a colonel, a husband and father who'd lost his way, an invisible man who dared to be seen. And now finally he was exactly who he was supposed to be. A pilot, a teacher, a grandfather, a story worth telling.